You won't believe what happened when a seemingly ordinary community in the heart of Atlanta decided they had endured enough. It is not without a certain irony that I set out to recount the story of Serafina Johnson, a woman whose spirit, much like the azaleas blooming in her garden each spring, refused to be crushed by the weight of the world, particularly the relentless cruelty of Atlanta's elite in 2024. Her life, etched with the struggles and resilience of the Black community, was about to undergo a transformation, a radical change, triggered by an unexpected event that would reverberate through the city's gilded halls. Serafina, or Sarah, as she was affectionately known, was a woman sculpted by the sun and storms of life. At 28, she possessed a face that told stories, of laughter etched around her kind eyes, the deep lines of worry that occasionally furrowed her brow, and the quiet strength that emanated from her. Her skin, the color of rich mahogany, bore the subtle imprints of a life lived outdoors, reflecting the Georgia sun. She usually wore her hair in neat braids, often adorned with colorful beads, a nod to her heritage and a personal expression of her style. Sarah's slender but athletic build spoke of a tireless energy, a constant striving. She was a single mother, fiercely protective of her 7-year-old daughter Maya, whose bright spirit and infectious giggle were the cornerstones of Sarah's world. Sarah was a cleaner, working tirelessly for several families in the affluent Buckhead neighborhood. She took immense pride in her work, despite the stark contrast between her modest apartment and the opulent mansions she maintained. The social setting was Atlanta, a city of gleaming skyscrapers and historic charm, a place of both opportunity and stark inequalities. Buckhead, with its sprawling mansions, manicured lawns, and exclusive country clubs, represented the pinnacle of wealth. It stood in stark contrast to the Vine City neighborhood, where Sarah and Maya lived. Vine City, with its tight-knit community, historic churches, and vibrant street life, was often overlooked, forgotten, and the site of systemic inequality that seemed to perpetuate itself. It was a community built on resilience, on the backs of those who, like Sarah, worked tirelessly to create a better life, despite the persistent challenges. The antagonism, or rather the catalyst for the conflict, came in the form of the prestigious Atlanta Country Club. A bastion of old money and entrenched privilege, the club stood as a symbol of the city's power structure. Within its walls, decisions were made, deals were brokered, and the lives of people like Sarah were, often unknowingly, impacted. The president of the club, and thus the primary antagonist by circumstance, was Arthur Sterling, a man in his late 50s with a silver comb-over that did little to hide the thinning hair, a meticulously tailored suit, and eyes that held a cold, calculating glint. Sterling, a descendant of one of Atlanta's founding families, viewed the world through the lens of entitlement. He was used to getting what he wanted and considered anyone outside his social circle to be, at best, inconvenient. His primary concern was the maintenance of the club's prestige and the preservation of his family's legacy. To maintain the club's appearance and its financial health, Sterling and the board were planning a radical change that would impact Vine City and ultimately Sarah's and the entire community's existence. The initial conflict arose with the announcement of the club's expansion plans. The project would involve the acquisition and demolition of several properties in Vine City, ostensibly to build a new, championship-level golf course and a luxury hotel complex. The land grab would displace families, disrupt the fabric of the community, and erase generations of history. While the club's representatives presented it as a mutually beneficial opportunity, offering generous compensation and relocation assistance, the reality was far more insidious. The compensation offered was insultingly low, the relocation assistance inadequate, and the motives, masked by philanthropic language, were purely selfish. Sarah was among the first to understand the true extent of the threat. She overheard hushed conversations, witnessed the condescending smiles of the club's representatives, and felt the palpable fear in her neighbors. The proposed expansion wasn't merely an inconvenience, it was an attack on their homes, their history, their very identity. Her home was not directly involved in the initial phase, but the ripple effects would be devastating. The loss of community businesses and the overall shift of demographics were inevitable. Sarah, with her innate sense of justice and her unwavering love for Maya and her community, decided she would not stand by and watch. She knew that the fight would be difficult, against an opponent with resources and influence that she could only dream of. But for the sake of her daughter, and for everyone in Vine City, she resolved to fight. The suspenseful element was a secret meeting which Sarah accidentally stumbled upon. One afternoon, while cleaning a sprawling mansion in Buckhead, she overheard a clandestine conversation. The mansion belonged to a member of the country club board, a woman named Eleanor Abernathy, who was known for her philanthropic gestures and her concern for the community. But Sarah, while polishing the gleaming silver, overheard the real story. Eleanor, unaware of Sarah's presence, was discussing the expansion plan with Arthur Sterling via speakerphone. The details were chilling. Sterling was complaining about the residents' resistance. Eleanor suggested a strategy of manipulation. Divide the community, offer incentives to key individuals, and use legal loopholes to expedite the process. Sarah, her heart pounding in her chest, realized that this wasn't just about land. It was about power, about control, and about the deliberate destruction of a community to serve the interests of the wealthy. The contrast between the setting and the characters became stark. Sarah, a woman of humble means and unwavering integrity, was pitted against Arthur Sterling, a man of immense wealth and questionable ethics. The peaceful streets of Vine City were threatened by the opulence of Buckhead, and the community was facing a fight for its very survival. The unexpected twist, however, arrived in the form of a seemingly innocuous piece of information that Sarah uncovered. The club's expansion plans were contingent on obtaining a rare, protected species of orchid that grew only on a small parcel of land within Vine City. The land was owned by an elderly woman named Mrs. Evelyn Dubois, a pillar of the community and a direct descendant of one of the neighborhood's founders. Knowing the importance of the orchid, Sarah now knew that the club would do everything to get Mrs. Dubois' land. This crucial detail gave her a glimmer of hope and a strategic advantage, but she knew she had to act fast. As Part 1 concludes, Sarah, armed with this newfound information, makes a fateful decision. She gathers her neighbors in the community center. The flickering lights of the old building, the scent of years of history, and the faces of her friends and neighbors create an atmosphere of tension and determination. Sarah, standing before them, shares the information she learned. She proposes a radical change in strategy. Rather than simply protesting the expansion, they will focus their efforts on protecting Mrs. Dubois and her land. She declares a new approach. They want our land? Fine, but they won't get it easily. We will protect Mrs. Dubois, and we will protect our community, even if it costs us everything. But as she finishes speaking, a sudden blackout plunges the community center into darkness. A collective gasp ripples through the room. When the emergency lights flicker on, a figure stands in the doorway. It's Arthur Sterling, his face an impassive mask, flanked by two imposing men in dark suits. He looks directly at Sarah, his eyes cold and resolute. He speaks, his voice amplified in the sudden silence, saying, "I admire your enthusiasm, Ms. Johnson. However, some things are inevitable. Consider this a friendly warning." His gaze shifts to Maya, who is clutching her mother's hand, her eyes wide with fear. Sterling continues, "You wouldn't want anything to happen to the people you care about now, would you?" The sudden blackout, the ominous presence of Arthur Sterling, and his thinly veiled threat hung heavy in the air, a stark punctuation mark at the end of Sarah's rallying speech. The community center, once a symbol of unity and hope, now felt charged with fear. Sarah, her protective instinct surging, instinctively shielded Maya, pulling her close. The room, moments ago alive with determination, was now hushed, filled with a palpable sense of dread. Sterling's words, a chilling combination of intimidation and veiled promises, had achieved their desired effect. The threat against Maya, a tactic as old as power itself, was a brutal reminder of the vulnerability of the community. The air crackled with unspoken questions. What was Sterling capable of? How far would he go to achieve his goals? Sarah, despite the fear that coiled in her gut, refused to show weakness. She met Sterling's gaze, her own eyes blazing with defiance. "We are not afraid of you, Mr. Sterling," she retorted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We will not be intimidated. We will protect our community." Sterling merely offered a dismissive smile, a subtle twist of his lips that spoke volumes about his contempt. "We shall see, Ms. Johnson," he said, before turning and leading his silent enforcers out of the building. The slam of the door echoed the resounding shock of the moment. The development of the conflict deepened with Sterling's direct intervention. His actions, far from being merely an attempt at intimidation, escalated into a calculated campaign designed to dismantle the community's resistance. First, there were the subtle pressures, the abrupt cancellation of contracts for community businesses, the sudden denial of loans, and the mysterious disappearance of resources that Vine City residents depended on. Then, the more overt maneuvers began. One of the key catalysts for change was the introduction of a charismatic, yet morally ambiguous figure. Reverend Thomas Bell, a man with a booming voice, a dazzling smile, and a reputation for being a community leader. The antagonist in this phase was not Sterling directly, but the manipulative tactics he employed through a proxy. Bell had, until recently, been a staunch supporter of the community, preaching the virtues of unity and perseverance. But as the crisis deepened, Bell began to waver. He started to advocate for a compromise with the country club, suggesting that a deal could be reached, a middle ground found, that would benefit everyone. Sarah, however, saw through Bell's facade. She observed the subtle changes in his demeanor, the expensive new suit, the expensive car he began driving, and the hushed phone calls he took, often in the presence of known Sterling associates. Sarah suspected Bell was being bought, that he was, knowingly or unknowingly, being used to undermine the community's resistance. This betrayal stung Sarah deeply. She had trusted Bell, respected him, and considered him a vital ally. His actions were the kind of radical change that cut the deepest and most painful. The initial obstacles faced by Sarah and the community were manifold. They had limited financial resources, legal expertise, and political influence. Sterling and the country club, on the other hand, possessed an army of lawyers, public relations experts, and a vast network of contacts that could be leveraged to their advantage. They controlled the media narrative, shaping public perception and painting the residents of Vine City as obstructionists. The pacing of the story slowed to highlight these challenges. The seemingly endless meetings, the frustrating legal loopholes, and the constant feeling of being outmaneuvered. One example of an obstacle involved a local news outlet, the Atlanta Chronicle, which had initially reported on the community's plight with sympathy. However, after a series of informal meetings between Sterling and the paper's editor, the tone of the coverage shifted dramatically. The Chronicle began to focus on the benefits of the expansion and the unreasonable demands of the Vine City residents. This change forced Sarah and her allies to find an alternative way to get their message out, turning to social media, local community newsletters, and organizing public rallies. The fight to protect Mrs. Dubois and her land was a particularly difficult obstacle. The Sterling's team tried to persuade Mrs. Dubois to sell her property. They offered her a sum of money that would set her up for life, and they tried to appeal to her sense of legacy, arguing that the new golf course would bring prestige to Atlanta and that her contribution would be honored. Mrs. Dubois, however, remained steadfast. She was a woman of deep conviction, her family's history rooted in that land, and she refused to betray her ancestors. This strengthened Sarah's resolve. As the conflict intensified, Sarah's personal life also became a target. She faced intimidation tactics, including anonymous phone calls, threats against Maya, and subtle acts of harassment. One evening, returning from a community meeting, she found her apartment vandalized, with hateful messages scrawled across her door. The messages were intended to break her spirit. These experiences took a toll on her. She found herself grappling with fear, anger, and the overwhelming weight of responsibility. She realized that her fight was not just for the community, but for the protection of her daughter. Maya's safety became the driving force behind every decision she made. To counter the immense pressure, Sarah sought allies. She reached out to a diverse range of individuals: a young, idealistic lawyer named Daniel, a group of student activists from a nearby university, and a retired investigative journalist named Ms. Evelyn Wright, who was eager to expose the truth about Sterling and the country club. These individuals provided her with legal expertise, strategic advice, and moral support, helping her to navigate the treacherous political landscape. Sarah discovered that the orchid's existence was not just a botanical fact. It was tied to the land's historical significance. Local legends spoke of the plant as a symbol of resilience, a reminder of the community's ability to thrive in the face of adversity. To protect the land and the orchid, they organized public protests, launched a social media campaign, and hired a botanist to assess the orchid's environmental impact, trying to use legal loopholes to delay and, hopefully, block the project. As the conflict progressed, Sarah's leadership skills became evident. She was a skilled negotiator, a powerful speaker, and a natural organizer. She possessed an innate ability to unite people around a common cause, transcending racial and class divisions. She inspired the community to fight back and not surrender. Yet, the constant struggle took its toll. Doubt crept in, as did the exhaustion of fighting a relentless and powerful opponent. The constant pressure started to affect Maya. She saw the stress on her mother's face, heard the whispers of fear in the neighborhood, and sensed the tension that permeated their lives. Sarah realized that she needed to protect Maya from the harsh realities of the conflict, shielding her from the direct threats while instilling in her a sense of hope and resilience. Sarah and Maya went for walks, painted, and read books, creating moments of normalcy amidst the storm. One afternoon, Maya asked a question that stopped Sarah in her tracks. "Mommy," she asked, her young eyes filled with concern, "are we going to lose our home?" The question, so simple yet so profound, forced Sarah to confront her fears. She realized that her fight was not just about land or property, it was about creating a future for Maya, a future where she could grow up in a safe and thriving community. The story shifted pace again with the introduction of a new character, a young, ambitious journalist named Jason, whose career depended on getting a big story. Jason had heard whispers about the country club's expansion and sensed a potential scandal. He made contact with Sarah, offering to help her expose the truth. However, Jason had secrets of his own. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The community's resistance, though persistent, began to falter. The pressures of time, the relentless attacks, and the insidious manipulations started to take their toll. The threat of Sterling loomed large, and the tension had become almost unbearable. Sarah, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings and protests, returned home to find a cryptic message left on her doorstep. The message was a single sentence, written in elegant calligraphy. "Meet me at the old oak tree at midnight." The note was unsigned, but Sarah knew immediately who had sent it. It was a final gamble, a desperate attempt to find out what Sterling was planning and what he would be doing. Midnight. The air hung heavy and humid under the blanket of a Georgia summer night. The moon, a silver sliver in the sky, cast long, eerie shadows from the gnarled branches of the old oak tree, a silent sentinel at the edge of Vine City, a witness to generations of secrets and struggles. Sarah, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, stood beneath its ancient boughs. The cryptic note, the unknown sender, and the risks involved were weighing heavily on her. She wore dark clothing, practical attire that blended with the shadows. Her braids were hidden beneath a simple cap. She had slipped away from Maya, who was sleeping soundly, with a silent prayer on her lips. Despite her fear, her determination remained unwavering. She had come too far to back down now. As the minutes ticked by, The silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness, a silhouette against the weak moonlight. It was Reverend Bell. The unexpected twist, the first of several that would reshape the narrative, was that Bell was the one who had summoned her. His face, etched with a mixture of regret and resolve, was illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. "Sarah," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I had to meet you. I couldn't live with this any longer." His words were a confession, a surrender. He admitted to having been manipulated by Sterling, to having been promised financial rewards and political favors in exchange for undermining the community's resistance. He revealed that Sterling had threatened to expose a secret from Bell's past, something that would have destroyed his reputation and his ministry. The information, a deep betrayal, was not a complete shock, but the depth of his involvement was. The conversation between Sarah and Bell became a crucible of intense emotions. Bell's shame, his fear, and his desperate attempt at redemption were palpable. He offered Sarah a crucial piece of information, a document that revealed the extent of Sterling's illegal activities, including tax evasion, bribery, and environmental violations related to the expansion project. The document was the key, Bell said, to stopping Sterling and saving Vine City. "I know I've failed you, Sarah. Failed the community," Bell confessed, his voice cracking with emotion. "But I want to make things right. This is the only way." The moral dilemma faced by Sarah was profound. Could she trust Bell, a man who had betrayed their trust? Could she forgive him? The answer, she knew, would determine the fate of her community. Sarah, torn between anger and the potential for salvation, listened to Bell's confession. She weighed the risks and the rewards, the damage he had done, and the opportunity he now offered. She asked pointed questions, probing his motives, seeking to determine the authenticity of his remorse. "Why, Reverend? Why did you do this?" Sarah demanded, her voice filled with a mixture of hurt and fury. "I was weak, Sarah," Bell replied, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I was afraid, and I was tempted." Sarah studied his face, searching for a flicker of sincerity. She saw the pain, the regret, and a flicker of hope. In the end, she decided to trust him. She accepted the document and agreed to work with him, but the path to their combined goal was now more dangerous. As they were talking, a light flashed in the distance. Sarah, startled, turned to see the young journalist Jason emerge from the shadows. "I knew something was going on," Jason said, a smug look on his face. "I've been following you both." The revelation served as the catalyst for an even deeper twist. Jason was not just a journalist. He was an operative working for Sterling. He had been tasked with gathering information, creating division, and discrediting Sarah. His presence was a carefully orchestrated attempt to silence them. Jason pulled out a camera and began taking pictures. "This is going to be a great story," he said with a smirk. But before he could do anything, a gunshot rang out. The sound echoed through the night, shattering the fragile piece. Jason staggered backward, clutching his chest, and collapsed to the ground. Sarah and Bell were frozen in shock. The second stretched into an eternity. Then, from the shadows, Arthur Sterling emerged, holding a smoking pistol. He had followed them, and the unexpected confrontation led to violence. "I warned you, Ms. Johnson," Sterling said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Some things are inevitable." The scene unfolded with the intensity of a nightmare. Sterling stood over the body of Jason, the weapon still in his hand. Sarah and Bell were trapped, caught in a web of deceit and violence. The dialogue between Sarah and Sterling crackled with tension. "You're a monster, Sterling," Sarah spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You killed him." "He was a liability," Sterling replied, his face impassive. "He knew too much." Sarah, knowing she was in mortal danger, desperately tried to reason with Sterling, appealing to his sense of humanity. She highlighted the futility of his actions, the damage he was causing, and the consequences he would face. "It's not worth it, Sterling," she pleaded. "Let it go. Let us go." Sterling remained unmoved. His single-minded focus was on achieving his goals and eliminating any obstacle in his path. "I will not be stopped, Ms. Johnson," he declared. "I will have what I want." The suspense mounted. What would Sterling do next? Would he kill Sarah and Belle? Would they be able to escape? Suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Sterling, realizing that his time was running out, turned to Sarah. "This isn't over," he said, his voice laced with menace. "Consider this a temporary setback." Then, he vanished into the darkness, leaving Sarah and Belle to face the police and to deal with the terrible aftermath of the night's events. The climax of the story had arrived. The police arrived on the scene. The bodies of Jason and the evidence of Sterling's crime was irrefutable. Sarah and Belle were left to explain what happened. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The police questioned Sarah and Belle. The media descended on Vine City. The community, once united in their fight, was now reeling from the shock of the night's events. Sarah, her world shattered, found herself facing the stark reality of the situation. She was a suspect in a murder, and she had to protect herself, Maya, and the community. She hired Daniel, the young lawyer she had befriended, who fought to get her released. The intensity of the situation forced Sarah to confront her fears, her doubts, and her own moral compass. She questioned her decisions, her actions, and the price she was willing to pay to fight for what she believed in. Her decision was made in the face of unimaginable pressure. The stakes were higher than ever. The world was watching, and the future of Vine City hung in the balance. The police investigation began, and the facts became clear. Belle testified and told the truth. Sterling had used him and Jason and ultimately killed Jason when he became a liability. The document Belle had given to Sarah became a critical piece of evidence. The evidence, along with Belle's testimony and Sarah's account of the events, began to turn the tide. The press, initially controlled by Sterling, began to shift its focus, spurred by the courage of some independent journalists who had been following the story. Public sentiment turned against Sterling. The community rallied around Sarah, offering their support, their prayers, and their unwavering belief in her innocence. The truth, the radical change in the truth, was slowly beginning to emerge. The dawn broke over Vine City, casting a pale light on the aftermath of the night's dramatic events. The air, still thick with the residue of fear and uncertainty, carried with it the scent of hope as the community began to rally around Sarah. The unexpected turn of events, the death of Jason, the subsequent arrest, and the unfolding investigation had brought the fight to a fever pitch. Sarah, though physically and emotionally drained, found her resolve strengthened by the outpouring of support from her neighbors. The community center, once a focal point of planning and protest, became a sanctuary. Neighbors brought food, offered childcare, and provided a shoulder to cry on. They knew that their future, their home, depended on her fight. The resolution of the conflict began with the legal battle against Arthur Sterling. Armed with Belle's testimony, the document, and the evidence from the crime scene, Daniel, the young lawyer, built a strong case. He used the media to his advantage, leaking information and galvanizing public opinion. He turned the tables on Sterling. The press, no longer controlled by Sterling's influence, was reporting on the story with a renewed focus, exposing his past misdeeds and the insidious nature of his actions. Meanwhile, the investigation by the police was also gaining momentum. Detective Miller, a seasoned officer with a strong sense of justice, was leading the case. He was not easily swayed by money or power. He saw the truth of what had happened and the callous disregard for human life that Sterling embodied. The detective carefully pieced together the events of the night, building a case that would lead to Sterling's downfall. The consequences of Sterling's actions were becoming clear. His reputation was in tatters. His business empire was crumbling. The investors were pulling out. The country club, once a symbol of his power, was under scrutiny, its activities and financial practices exposed to public view. However, Sterling was a formidable opponent. He used every trick in the book to undermine the legal proceedings, using his influence to delay court dates, intimidate witnesses, and spread disinformation. He tried to buy off Daniel, offering him a lucrative partnership in his law firm. He sent subtle threats to the members of the community, hoping to scare them into silence. But the community stood firm. They refused to be silenced. They refused to be intimidated. They organized rallies, protests, and public meetings. They shared their stories, their experiences, and their commitment to the cause. They became the moral compass of the city. They had witnessed Sterling's cruelty firsthand, and they were not going to let him win. The climax of the courtroom drama occurred during the final hearing. The courtroom was packed. The atmosphere was charged with tension. Sterling sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of indifference. Sarah sat in the front row, her hand clasped tightly in Maya's. Daniel presented the evidence against Sterling, meticulously building his case. He presented the document that Bell had provided, revealing Sterling's illegal activities. He called witnesses, who testified about Sterling's intimidation tactics and his disregard for human life. He showed images of the crime scene and of Jason's body, his face and eyes reflecting the pain of those present. Sterling, despite his best efforts, was unable to counter the mounting evidence. His carefully constructed facade began to crumble. He was forced to listen to the evidence that highlighted his ruthlessness. The turning point, the moment that sealed Sterling's fate, came when Detective Miller took the stand. He described the events of the night, presenting irrefutable evidence that linked Sterling to Jason's murder. He described the intimidation tactics and the pattern of abuse. The most dramatic moment came when Daniel called Reverend Bell to the stand. Bell, visibly shaken but determined, recounted the events of the night, providing a powerful testimony. He apologized for his past mistakes and expressed his remorse for his actions. His testimony, filled with emotion and conviction, was a turning point in the case. He revealed Sterling's corrupt tactics and the lengths to which he had gone to destroy Vine City. The jury, a diverse group of individuals, listened intently. They saw the evidence, they heard the testimonies, and they felt the emotional impact of the case. They saw the truth, and they rendered their verdict. The jury found Arthur Sterling guilty on all counts: murder, bribery, tax evasion, and environmental violations. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Sterling's face was a mask of shock and fury. The verdict was a stunning victory for Sarah and the community. It was a powerful indictment of the corrupt system that had allowed Sterling to wield such power for so long. The consequences of Sterling's actions extended beyond his legal troubles. His family, horrified by his actions, disowned him. His social circle ostracized him. He was left alone. He was sentenced to life in prison, a fitting end to his reign of terror. With Sterling removed, a period of radical change in Vine City began. The expansion plan was halted. The community had saved their land. The orchid, the symbol of their struggle, became a symbol of their resilience, their heritage, and their triumph. The final reflection of the story focused on the transformative power of community, the importance of justice, and the resilience of the human spirit. The events in Vine City served as a call to action. It highlighted the need for people to stand up against injustice, to fight for what they believed in, and to protect their communities. Sarah, having emerged victorious, became a community leader, a voice for the voiceless. She used her platform to advocate for social justice, for economic equality, and for the preservation of the environment. She became a symbol of hope. Her struggle changed her. It had tested her, pushed her to her limits, and forced her to confront her fears. But it had also strengthened her. She had become a beacon of inspiration. The resolution of the story was a bittersweet one. While the community had achieved victory, the scars of the conflict remained. The loss of Jason, the betrayals, and the years of struggle had taken their toll. But the community was stronger, more united, and more determined than ever before. The final scene of the story takes place several years later. Sarah, now a respected community leader, is standing in a park that was once slated to become the golf course. The park, a vibrant green space, is filled with children playing, families picnicking, and friends gathering. It is a testament to the community's resilience. The orchid, blooming in a protected area of the park, is a reminder of their fight and their victory. Maya, now a teenager, approaches her mother. "Mom," she says, "are you proud of what we did?" Sarah smiles, embraces her daughter, and replies, "Very proud, my love, very proud." The final words of the story are a call to action, an invitation for the audience to reflect on the themes of the story and to consider their own roles in the fight for justice and equality. It is also a hook, teasing the potential for future stories. The fight continues, the narrator reflects. The struggle for justice is a never-ending process. The story of Vine City is a reminder that the power of community, the strength of the human spirit, and the pursuit of truth will always endure. But will the wealthy ever truly change? Will the communities always be vigilant? What other battles lie ahead? And what about the family that lost everything? Only time will tell.